Hello and welcome to Series 5 of Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 7 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far, far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. But you'll also hear from renowned crisis managers, mental health experts and other advisors who were in the room when major crises have hit, all of them offering useful, practical coping techniques and tips, and all with the straightforward aim of guiding you towards a more resilient approach to life and whatever it might throw at you. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search for Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some great playlists. And if you enjoy what you hear on this podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating and review. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Our handle is @CrisisWhatCrisisPodcast. Today, I'm joined by a woman who found herself at the centre of what is one of Britain's biggest miscarriages of justice. Between 2000 and 2015, the Post Office bullied and prosecuted more than 700 innocent sub-postmasters and post mistresses, almost one a week. Those prosecutions, carried out by the Post Office Criminal Law Division, were based on evidence gathered from a recently installed, but as it turned out, fatally flawed computer system called Horizon. Some went to prison following convictions for false accounting and theft. Many were financially ruined and shunned by the communities that they'd served. Some others died before they were cleared. Our guest today, Pauline Stonehouse, was forced into bankruptcy, lost her home, and in 2007 was convicted of 6 counts of false accounting, convictions which were formally overturned only very recently. This is an appalling story of an entirely unnecessary crisis, driven by a misguided institutional belief that hundreds upon hundreds of sub-postmasters were not pillars of their communities, but instead that they were all individually, quite independently, sophisticated criminals. In Pauline's case, the Post Office simply decided to trust a machine ahead of a mum and an employee who was respected and experienced. And then they set out to ruin her life with her husband and children as collateral damage. This was a very British scandal, uncovered in the end thanks to journalists like the brilliant Nick Wallace, and the victims are now set to get compensation. Pauline, I'm sure you'll agree, is incredible, handling the unraveling of a happy life in a seaside town with incredible strength and without self-pity, but also, as you'll hear, a very heavy reliance on a sense of humour, that always undervalued crisis tool. One of the most astonishing elements of this story is that the same thing was happening to strangers up and down the country, all of them being told by the Post Office that they had to be prosecuted to set an example to others. Pauline thought they all thought that they were the only ones. So this is the story of an ordinary woman thrown into the centre of a truly extraordinary crisis. And it's packed with lessons, I think, for anyone who has lost control or who fears losing control of their life for whatever reason. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. Pauline Stonehouse, thank you so much for joining me today on Crisis What Crisis. We've talked on this podcast with people who've come through all manner of challenges, but never have I had the privilege of speaking to someone who's come out the other side of their crisis so recently. Mm-hmm. You found out that your conviction was overturned on November 22nd, I think.
Yeah.
The formal end to a very long and very damaging journey, although of course you will quite rightly not be stopping here in terms of getting justice for what happened to you. But are you, Pauline, are you beginning to come to terms with what's happened yet?
I think I came to terms with it a long time ago. I just thought I would never get the answers to what actually happened. I just thought, what happened, and I was, just a one-off person. It wasn't until a few years later that, quite a few years later, that I found out I wasn't the only one. So, yes, it was now I know what's gone on, and I wasn't the only one, and now I'll have my conviction overturned. Oh, it's amazing, really. I think it's the acceptance of that, isn't it? And I think it is hard to accept what they've done to me.
Yes.
But now the conviction's been overturned, I think acceptance has got to happen, isn't it? But I don't think any of us will ever get a satisfactory apology from them, rather than their generic letter that they send out, which was a joke. But
let's talk about that. Let's talk about that briefly. I do want to go back and talk about life pre-crisis quickly, but let's just talk about that letter for a moment. Essentially, what you got, and anyone listening to this, very easy to find the letter. Just go on to Pauline's Twitter account. We'll leave the details on we'll leave the link. But essentially, what you got was a sort of standard letter, not personalised at all. Same letter that's being sent to everyone who's involved in this, saying sorry, but not really.
Not really sorry, is it? It really isn't. And it wasn't until when I first opened the letter and saw it, I thought, wow, they've actually listened and they've actually apologised. And then when I read it again, I thought, oh my God, this is so generic. They're just trying to pull the wool over your eyes, aren't they? They're just thinking, well, you're going to accept this and that will be all right. But it's not, is it?
No, it's interesting to me. Obviously, I'm interested in communications. That's sort of part of my professional background. And this inability, even after everything that we now know about this scandal, which I think will become truly one of the great miscarriages of justice in this country.
Yeah.
Even now, the organisation involved can't manage to see that a letter that is tailored to the individual and that isn't a standard performer led by lawyers is not the answer. Anyway, look, let's talk a little bit about life before crisis, if I may, Pauline. You grew up in Wales, married to Christopher, 2 kids. Before those children arrived, I think I'm right in saying that you worked down in London in a number of different jobs. You worked on the Underground, I think, at one stage, but you also worked for Ryman's in London. If I understood it correctly, you essentially worked in their kind of post office concession. Is that right?
Yeah, I started off in their stationery shop. I started off in their Kings Road branch, actually. That's when I first started working for them. It was while I was there that they advertised that they had the franchise post offices and looking for staff to start. And I thought, oh, this is a different challenge. This is different, and I did. It was really bizarre training method. It was in a shop, in the basement of a shop somewhere in London. I can't remember what it was now. Somewhere in East London, with this like a pretend post office setup, with the little stamp, the old stamp things, which you had to change the dates yourself and cover yourself in ink, and these pretend stamps and stamp books. And it was about a 2 or 3 week training, and actually I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then, going into the first post office and starting off as a normal account assistant, and moved around a few of them, and eventually ended up as a manager in their Lower Regent Street branch, which was Haymarket, but it moved across to Lower Regent Street.
So you'd been around the post office. You understood kind of how important the post office actually is in people's lives, right? It's a centre, isn't it? Less so, I suppose, probably in a London suburb.
Regular customers, you get to meet all of them. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But when I was doing it there for Ryman's, it was the old manual system. Mm-hmm. It didn't become Horizon until I think it was 1999, which is the year my first daughter was born.
Yes. And Horizon, I should explain, is the computer system that sits at the centre of this appalling scandal. But we'll get on and explain that in more detail.
That, the old system, I don't know what I know. We have a technological age, and I know technology is the future and all that. But the old system worked. You'd never had any problems. You knew exactly what you had. You knew exactly what you were doing, what money came in, what money came out, what stamps you sold, what you started off with, like a typical accounting book, red and black. Ins and outs, and you knew exactly where you stood at the end of the week. And if anything was wrong, that it would come if a form had been sent off wrongly or done something wrong, it would come back, but you knew you had that paper trail to follow.
Yeah, it strikes me that point is at the heart of this. The post office, it strikes me an obvious point. I think really it misunderstood that their business was a human business.
Yeah,
they decided, as so many businesses do, actually, that you know what, we think we're a tech business.
Yeah,
but the post office is not a tech business; it is a human business, isn't it?
Yeah, you're the face of the post office. But I read an article this morning, actually, a bit on Twitter, and I think it was a Financial Times one. And I think it was brought up, and it was saying about how if a postmaster said that 2 and 2 is 4, but the computer said 2 and 2 is 5, they would believe the computer, not the postmaster.
Yes.
And that's what I read, and I thought, well, that's just farcical, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
a 3-year-old, probably a 4-year-old could tell you the 2 and 2 is 4.
Yeah.
But
it would be farcical if it wasn't so, frankly, so tragic.
Yeah.
Let's move forward to 2000, Pauline. You moved to Seaburn in Sunderland. You worked, I think, in a couple of other post office jobs in Sunderland before 2004, when the opportunity came up to buy your own shop and post office. Just tell me about that, because that must have been a lovely moment. That must have been a really a really positive moment in your life.
We looked into another post office, a smaller one and store in East Bolton, and we nearly bought that one, but I think in the end what ruled it out was where it was and access to it, so to speak. So in the end we found the Seaburn one, and we thought, oh, ideal. It's right on the seafront. It'll have the trade in the summer. So we jumped into it with both feet. And
a great sort of community.
Yes, it was. And we had our regulars, and they were lovely. And nothing better than going down first thing in the morning even on a winter's day or on a summer's day, and the sun rising, and I could go for a break and go and splash my feet in the sea, because you were literally right across the road from the seafront, and it was lovely. You had your regulars in, and they came in, and they not long after, well, so a year or so later, I found out I was pregnant, and they were all fussing over me, and it was great. It was like one big family. It was one of the best times of my life at the start of it all, until obviously it started going wrong.
Things were fine for what, a couple of years before you started to notice that there were shortfalls. I think the Horizon system was in place, wasn't it? It was upgraded, and then from that moment on, the shortfalls began to appear. So what's in your mind, Pauline, when that first starts to happen?
I was puzzled at first, really puzzled, because it just didn't make any sense. You go from having no issues at all to suddenly have £100 missing, £200 missing, £300 missing. You think, and then it was happening every single week, and you think, okay, fine, well, it'll come back and it'll sort itself out. But it happened often enough to really start to worry, to then have to make phone calls, to think, well, look, why am I getting these constant shortages? I never did before. So what's going wrong?
Who are you calling? Is it an area manager, or is there some sort of central? The helpline.
Yeah. And they're meant to be there. You just say, look, I'm a postmaster. You give them your post office number and basically say, look, I've got this problem. I'm showing this shortage this week. I don't understand why this has happened. And they'll go, oh, it'll correct itself. It'll come back. I shouldn't worry about it. Nothing's wrong. And I'm like, oh, okay, but this has only been going on since I've changed from the old system to the combined till shop and post office counter.
Yeah.
I said, that's only been happening since then. And they were like, well, I wouldn't worry about it. It'd be fine. But it carried on happening, and I wasn't getting any satisfactory answers to why I was getting then consistently larger and larger losses.
Let's just explain very quickly what the kind of process is really, because under the Horizon system, as I understand it, you began to use a touchscreen. You were using a touchscreen to process payments for utility bills, driving licenses, banking services, all sorts of other stuff. But they could also sort of pay out you pay out pensions, sell stamps, all that stuff that runs through a post office was all done now through a touch screen process. Yeah. And then you'd look at your numbers, at the end of a week? And that's when it would appear?
Always a Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday evening, you close for the day, and then that's when so gradually towards the end of that day, you would count your stock, you know what money you'd have in your safe, and you know what you would gradually count your stamps, because you didn't generally sell that many stamps, but you would count the majority of your stock. And then when it came to the last customer leaving, the doors closing, then you would do your final cashing up of your cash and putting all your stuff through. And then
right. So increasingly then over time, that sort of Wednesday afternoon moment, I assume you began to somewhat dread, what am I going to discover now?
Yeah. It was going from you could balance within half an hour, you'd have a figure within half an hour, to it being taking an hour and a half, 2 hours, because you're going back over your figures, rechecking your stock, recounting your money in your safe, all of that to just check that you hadn't missed anything, or something had been put away wrong or whatever. And it never did correct itself. It was just.
So was it every week you were spotting a problem of one size or another?
Not every week. It would say it would be you could expect a couple of pound, £10, £20. You can expect that to a point, but not when it's large sums. So I would say on average in the beginning, I would say it was perhaps twice a week, but it was a large sum, and then it was smaller amounts on the other weeks.
Yeah.
But I never got on. You would expect, if it was a human error, you would expect it to be, you'd have some overs and some shortages, but it was always short.
Yes. So it was never over.
It was never over. So that's when it gets suspicious. So why is it?
Yes.
Why is it? And at one point, it was telling me I was hundreds of pounds short in stamps. Physical stamps, and I thought, well, I don't sell that many stamps, so how can I be hundreds of pounds short in stamps? And I actually phoned the helpline for that and just said, why suddenly are my stamp records showing differently when I haven't sold much this week? I might sell the odd first or second class stamp.
You
print a label off for somebody coming in to send a package. You're not sticking hundreds of stamps on a box.
Yeah, and presumably when you're ringing the helpline, what you're not hearing is, oh, do you know what, Pauline, actually, we've had 2 or 3 other people mention this.
Yeah, you never hear that, no. And
when we now know, of course, full well that there were...
we know there was more, yeah.
Not two or three, there were hundreds.
700 over 700 of us.
Of phone calls being made of people finding themselves in the same position as you.
Yeah.
And the system, again, as I understand it, means that where there were shortfalls, in the first instance, they come out of your wages, right?
Yeah. Well, no. Initially, they come out of whatever cash you can put in. So if it was £20 short, the £20 would come out of my pocket and go in, and it would balance it to zero. And that would be the end of that. And you'd start the Thursday morning with a clean slate.
Right.
And we did that for quite a few months. It was coming out of the shop take-ins and it was going in.
Because you believe that at some point down the line...
It would come back.
It would come back. It would be...
It would correct itself. It'd end up back in my pocket and back in my shop till.
Yeah.
Back in my bank account, but it never did. And then they got the point in the end then when I couldn't do that no more, because it was such larger quantities that if it came to the end, because you would balance every week, but at the end of the 4 weekly periods, when you've got to put exactly it right, if you know what I mean, you've got to balance it for the month. It came to the point when there were such large sums that I couldn't afford to put £1,000 out of my shop take-ins into that. I couldn't do it no more. And then they started taking it from my wages. So I'd say, look, I can't pay this shortfall. Can we come to an agreement? Yes, we'll take it out of your wage each month. And they would take a relatively large amount out of my account each month.
What was the moment, Pauline, when that sort of tipped over from being, you know what, this is a worry, this is a concern, but I think it will balance out, into, this is now becoming just a black hole that's just swallowing up money. I don't quite know where all this is heading.
I don't remember the exact point, but I know I was leaving the post office on a Wednesday in tears every night.
Really?
And I would go to I'd call in to see my in-laws at the weekend, and they go, because they knew what was going on. I was getting stressed out over it. And I go, I don't understand it. I really don't understand it. I just can't take much more of this, because nothing makes sense anymore. I go from, running a post office in London, like I said, and never having any issues, to working in other people's branches and them having never any issues, to then me suddenly having all of this money disappearing and not knowing where it's going. So then doubting yourself then to think, well, am I doing something wrong? Am I incompetent? Why did I buy this place in the first place? This is the biggest mistake ever. Do you know what I mean? It was worrying. And obviously my husband was just as worried. But obviously he was, yes, involved in the post office side, but he wasn't really, the running of it was down to me. So he knew I knew the ins and outs of it more than anybody else.
Yeah.
So the fact that I was stressed out, then that made him stressed out. And in the end, obviously we couldn't take them, put any more money in, and we couldn't afford to have them take any more out of my wages because I'd have no living wages left. So that's at that point where I think I broke really and knew that I couldn't do anymore, and that I made the mistake of false accounting, of declaring money was there when it wasn't, hoping, like I said, and hoping that at some point somebody would find an error somewhere and it would correct itself, but it never did. And it went on for a good few months, if not longer, 6 months or so. I would say that I was doing that, if not longer. And it wasn't until I'd gone to a meeting in the hotel just down the road from the post office, and one of the district managers was there, and I just basically broke down and just said, look, I can't take any more of this. I can't do this no more. This is what I've been doing. I've been to you for help. You're not giving me any help. You need to sort something. And literally, she goes, you know what's going to happen now? I said, yes, I know what's going to happen now. And I was suspended basically on the spot. So you're told that somebody was going to be in the next morning, and the keys for the safe and the post office part were taken off me. I wasn't allowed to set foot, touch the money, nothing. An audit was done, and what I thought the amount was short ended up being more. So they found even more money missing.
Give us the approximate numbers at this stage, Pauline.
In the end, about £15,000. That's what the shortfall was.
Right. And
that had been building over a good 4, 5, 6 months perhaps.
Yeah. And
the stress of that is because they can send an auditor in at any time to any post office to check you. So the whole time I was worried that an auditor was going to walk in that door and decide to audit me and find that shortage. And thankfully they never did. And I think that in a sense that the fact that I went to them and told them what I'd done, I think that really helped my case in a sense. Because I wouldn't have gone to them if I'd done something wrong. If I was guilty of stealing that money, which is what they accused me of initially, I wouldn't have gone to tell them that I'd done that, would I?
No. So there are two things at play here on the other side of the fence, right? We know now, don't we? One is, as we've already touched on, there are hundreds of people who are working or within the post office system up and down the country in communities. Really, post offices that are the sort of hubs of their communities, deeply sort of embedded in a sort of real position of trust, who were suffering exactly the same problem as you to one degree or another, and who were pleading with the post office to help them make sense of what was going on. That's the first thing that we now know. The second thing that we now know, of course, is that the post office had sort of institutionally decided that this amazing new computer system that Fujitsu had built for them, Horizon system, had exposed, a secret truth about those postmasters up and down the country. That in fact there was this kind of unconnected network of master criminals who had been clearly and who were now ripping off the post office secretly, and that this amazing new computer system had exposed them all.
Yeah,
and that was essentially the belief within the post office that drove this whole campaign against you all. Madness.
It's complete madness, because they can't go from prior to that, surely having next to no convictions of postmasters through theft, to suddenly having hundreds of us what did they think suddenly? Did we all decide, like you say, did we all decide to join together and go, all I know, let's go and rip them off this week?
Well, I think they decided that their piece of technology had, had revealed something that presumably they believed had been going on for many, many years. But this comes to the point of the business, believing itself to be something that it's not, right? It's a people business. Because if you look at, anyone listening to you now on this podcast, it takes 5 minutes to work out, Pauline, that you're a straightforward, hardworking, member of the community, as most of these, I suspect all of these people were, right? They're pillars of the community.
We're all from different walks of life, some from very professional people who have took retirement and decided to take post offices on, and then consequently had their lives ruined. Worse so, ex-policemen, teachers, retired. The mind boggles how people's lives have been totally ruined. And I read one this morning, and it was one of the first ones was when she was actually pregnant, and she's got sent to prison for 15 months.
That's right.
I couldn't believe that. And I think the more stories, the problem is that because nobody knows about them, people think it's not happening. So even me being one of them, I don't know half of these stories, and the more I discover, the more upset I am for everybody else, not just me.
So you're suspended in the first instance, and then dismissed by the post office. Just tell us what they sort of are saying to you at that point. When you were suspended, was it also explained to you that you were now at risk of being prosecuted?
Yeah.
And presumably at that stage, the consequences of being convicted of the crime that they are suggesting that you committed is pretty serious, right? There was the immediate threat that this could mean that you go to prison.
Yeah, the immediate threat the accusation was that I'd stolen the money. That's what they assumed, that's what they presumed, and that's what they accused me of. But they had no evidence to say that. They had access to my bank records, so they had no proof that I'd stolen any money. They had no proof that I was suddenly buying, that I was buying extra things that I needed. They had no proof to say that I was putting it into the shop. And they accused it was a long interview process above a post office in Durham by their investigation team. And I was treated like a criminal. They acted like I was a criminal, the way they interviewed me. It went on for hours, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at me, trying to throw me off my game. In the end, accusing my husband of taking the money and not telling me. And I said, well, why would he do that? And they said, well, why wouldn't he do that? Why would he have to tell us? Because we're married and we love each other, and he wouldn't destroy that. We don't keep secrets from each other. But how do you not know? How do you know? So that puts then the doubt into your head. And then there was accusations thrown at, how do you know it's not a member of staff doing it? And I'm going, well, it's possible. Of course it is. Of course it's possible, because they had access to the safe when I wasn't there. So it's possible, but I highly much doubt it. But they couldn't prove that either. But I think at the end of it, it was a case of, right, we know, okay, we think you haven't stolen the money, but we've got to prosecute you anyway, because we've got to set an example for, so others can't do it too. And I thought,
which was a fundamental untruth.
Which is a fundamental untruth. Now we know. I didn't know that at the time, did I? But that's a fundamental. Obviously, at that point, at 2008 or 2007, when I was first interviewed, they've been going on since 1999, isn't it? Yes. Or 2004, that the first conviction was. So they were telling me lies to try and get me to admit to something that I didn't do. And to then to say that they have to prosecute me. No, they didn't have to prosecute me. And to them to the potential was there to ruin my marriage as well. And having a young family too. And then to get dragged all through the court system. And then on the actual final day of the court, for their barrister to actually stand there and say, look, Mrs. Stonehouse didn't steal the money. We just think she's naive and a bit immature in a attitude towards the post office and her actions. But you can't do any more to her than what has already happened, as in losing her home, losing her livelihood, all that sort of thing. So what more can you do to her? Just give her the lowest you can possibly do. But at that point, they could have pulled out, couldn't they?
Yes, of course.
If they know I haven't stolen the money and they know that I'm not a bad person, then why continue to prosecute me then?
Exactly. Let's take a couple of steps back, because you reference it there, Pauline. But before you get to that point, right, before you get to the sort of legal conclusion of your case, its impact on you and your family is already damaging, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
You've had to declare yourself bankrupt.
Yeah.
This is after you leave the post office. You've had to declare yourself bankrupt, and you've lost your home.
Yeah.
Just talk to us a little. Give us a little bit more detail about what the impact was for you and your family.
Well, I think after being suspended and then no longer having the post office wage coming in, the shop then was no longer viable, the shop side of it, because obviously it wasn't bringing enough money to pay our mortgage and pay our bills and such like. So the decision was made that we had to go bankrupt. And that was, I think, in par with the day of being convicted and in the distress side of things. To know to go to court that day and to pay the money to go bankrupt for each of us, for me and my husband, to walk back into the shop to know that this is no longer mine.
Yes.
And that I have to hand that over. And all the hard work and the changes that we'd put into that. It was just as hard as being convicted, because you have all these plans in your head of what you're going to do with your life, and that shop was part of it. It was going to help support my children. So to then lose that and then know that I can no longer pay the mortgage either because of having no income coming in, to then be threatened by the bank then that they're going to take the house off me, but where am I going to live? So we instantly then applied to the local council for to get rehomed. We got offered one place which was so awful that I felt like I had to take it initially because I didn't have much of a choice.
Yeah.
Where you've got exposed electric points when you walk in the door, your fuse boxes and all that. There was nothing there covering them up. Gas pipe was all visible as well. The landlord of there said that's where it was going to have to be. They wouldn't even try and cover it, even with a small child. And I accepted the keys, and I thought, fine. The former husband said that, I accept the keys for this house. He says, right, come on, I'll come and meet you there after work. He walked in the door, he went, we're not living here over my dead body.
How were you coping with this sort of unraveling of every part of your life?
I don't think I was. I think that's when my insomnia really kicked in. I'm asthmatic. I've got eczema. Everything seemed to flare up around that time. I just felt like my world was falling apart. I just didn't know what else to do. My husband was lucky. He managed to get a job pretty quickly. So we had some money coming in then. But obviously I had no income.
How public was it by this stage? I mean, was the extent of it known publicly?
No, I don't think it was publicly known until actually it went to court, till the final day of court, where I was actually photographed outside the court leaving.
Right.
And it was on the front of the local Echo paper and another one as well, a Chronicle.
Yes.
It was on the front of there with me leaving the court. And obviously I didn't say anything to the person photographing me as I left.
So coping then, obviously, Christopher's an amazing bloke. You got an amazing marriage to have withstood this, especially when, as you say, one of the lines of attack, if you like, from the post office is this idea that maybe he was doing something that you didn't know, which is pretty unpleasant. Let's put it mildly, shall we? The other thing actually here, Pauline, I just want to touch on quickly is that, the listener might not appreciate, I certainly didn't until I was looking at this story, that the post office actually operates unlike most other organizations, that it actually has a criminal law division within it.
Yeah.
And that criminal law division essentially operates kind of separate to the CPS process.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas you would normally have some degree of a kind of oversight from the Crown Prosecution Service, as I understand it, that is not the system that the Post Office operates, that it's essentially its own policeman, and it is also its own prosecution service.
Yeah.
And that it's able to pursue its employees through the courts with certainly with less oversight than you would expect in normal circumstances. And that's why this point about the kind of internal attitude that the Post Office decided to almost institutionally adopt is how you end with a scandal of this size, I suppose. But when you're dealing with Post Office people through this process, when you're being, this is before we get to the final court case,
mm-hmm.
Just give us a sense of the kind of pressure that they're putting you under, the sort of tone of voice, the attitude that they're taking towards you. What do you remember about that?
I didn't really have much communication with anybody apart from that. Apart from probably the initial first week, I would say, where I was suspended and the auditors came in and I was told what the final thing was. Then there may have been a few conversations with, we want you to come here for an interview. And I don't think I don't remember having any other interviews with any higher ups after that, or any conversations, especially apart from the investigation team on that last day where they said they were going to charge me with theft.
But you were interviewed more than once by the investigation team, or was it one set of interviews and the next thing you know you're charged, and the next thing
it was one interview which lasted for hours. Yeah. And then I was charged at the end of that interview.
How do you feel about that aspect now when you kind of look back on it? The sort of unwillingness to listen.
Hard done by, I suppose, in the sense that they had this idea in their head that I was guilty of something, and they weren't willing to listen to anything else. And they had their blinkers on. They knew what they wanted out of it, and they couldn't see any other evidence to say anything differently. As far as they was concerned, I was, the money had gone missing, and that's the way they went at me. So I think, hard done by in a sense, that, and being very, got at, bullied almost as well. The way they went at me as well. It was a woman who interviewed me, and I wouldn't want to meet her again. Well, if I met her again, I wouldn't be responsible for my actions probably. I probably wouldn't actually know her in the street. Just find how you block things out, don't you?
Yes.
And it wasn't until we were in Durham last weekend, and we're outside the post office in Durham, that my husband said to me, "This is where all this crap started." And I went, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, this is where you were interviewed above here." I went, "I was?" He went, "Yes." I went, "Oh, okay then." So I completely
you blacked it out.
Yeah, I thought it was in Newcastle. I thought I'd been interviewed in Newcastle, but no, apparently it was in Durham. But there's a lot of things I think you choose to black out, don't you? I think, because they are so stressful to you. What other choice do you have? Otherwise, you keep on playing it around in your head, and it never goes away, does it?
There's a theory that you should revisit the scenes of your disasters. That it's all part of the healing process to sort of reclaim it,
Reclaim it,
yeah. Look, we touched on the importance of your family. Obviously, I'm sure you would say the main reason you were able to get through is because of their love and support. Your dad, as well, I think, was also there for you throughout, and was
he came to many court hearings with me when he was
supporter. Yeah, talk to me a little bit about him.
What a man. If I get tearful, I apologise. If you were to choose anybody to be your father, you would choose him. He was one of a kind. He was very special. He had an amazing sense of humour.
Mm-hmm.
He had an amazing ability to put you at ease. He could walk into a room and a room would stop and look at him. He was such an imposing figure. He was a big man in his prime and when he was healthy. Everybody thought he was a policeman because he had that presence about him. He would walk in and people would stop and look when he walked into a pub or into a room. And he had that personality about him. He was, I think, told when he was a child he was either going to be prime minister, he was going to be, or he was going to be hung for doing something wrong. Because he was that sort of personality. He could elicit the crowd to mutiny. Do you know what I mean?
He would make his mark one way or the other.
Yeah, he would make his way in life. He'd make his mark one or the other. He didn't do either. He didn't commit murder, incite anything else. And he didn't become prime minister. But at our wedding day, he actually stood in the pulpit in the lovely Gothic chapel, Union Chapel in Islington, and said a little speech, read a thing out in during the service, and he was in his element. He looked like he belonged there. I think he should have been.
What was his name and what did he do for a living, Pauline?
His name was John Vernon Lewis, and up until he retired, he was a house manager, sort of like caretaker of a building in London for the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation. That's what he was then when he retired. Yeah. But he'd done many jobs through his life just to support his family, from working for Adidas in the plastics factory in Swansea, to being a security guard, which he was terrible at. And when they were building the marina in Swansea, he probably slept through most of it nighttime. And he was a little taxi driver for a while, and he was Air Force when he was a young man. He was ex-Air Force as well, which he was very proud, ex-services.
Yeah. He was with you, as I understand it, sort of every step of the way through this.
He was my biggest supporter and kept on telling me, come on, chick, he says, you'll be all right. We'll get through this together. He was amazing. He was my biggest supporter and best.
He must have been so angry on your behalf.
Oh, very angry. I think if he could have got hold of anybody, I think they would have regretted meeting my father. He was a placid man, but if you got on the wrong side, it wouldn't have been a very nice sight. He protected his children and he loved us all. But
we're talking about him in the past tense here. Because of course you lost your dad.
Yeah, 11 years ago.
Yeah. So where were you on this journey when you lost your father?
Oh, well, Dad died in 2010. Dad died. So,
yeah, this is 2 years after your. 2 years after. 2 years after your.
So at that point, we were in the house I'm in now, and he died not long after. So I've been in this house 11. Yeah.
So it's seen you through the worst of it.
Yeah.
It's seen you kind of survive it, but what he did not see, obviously, was the truth exposed.
Yeah.
What he didn't see was things even beginning to be put right.
Yeah, I think he would have been the first one to encourage to pursue the conviction being overturned. But I think he'd already passed away. But for the time I'd first heard about other postmasters going through the same thing, but he would have been the first person to push me towards it.
It must be. It must be just so upsetting for you that you can't. That
I can't share that with him.
That you can share that. Yeah. You said earlier that the bankruptcy was as painful as the conviction.
Yeah.
And they both carry, don't they? Other implications, which is sometimes I think misunderstood about what comes with the conviction, is that it does impact your day-to-day life.
Yeah, because
things like insurances, things like how the banks treat you, when you're filling out forms, the kind of administration of life changes. Yeah.
You can't apply for loans because it's generally a chance you won't get one. Bank accounts, we couldn't get a bank account with most high street banks. after that happened. So we were lucky. The co-op were really good.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up with a basic bank account with them, so we could do our direct debits and that through with the husband's new job. But yeah, it impacts a lot. So you can't even go, if you wanted to go and get like a high purchase for like a sofa or a car or things like that, that wasn't going to happen. We ended up we managed to put away a bit of cash. We had no car for a while, and we ended up getting a little banger. So you could have so we had a bit of a car for weekends and that, when doing shopping and things, because we couldn't have got a loan to get a car. So yeah, big impact. You don't realise it until you actually go through it, how much it affects it. And then obviously then future job prospects for me with the conviction, then if I want to go and do a further search for a DBS check, then it's going to show up. So that means you're working in any sort of financial establishment or in a school or with children. They'll do an advanced search and it'll come up, and I had to explain myself on a few occasions, even just to do voluntary work in a school. They do a DBS check and it came up, and I had to sit there in a little interview and explain myself and said, look, I didn't do anything wrong. It was just false accounting. But this is what happened. I'm not a bad person. I'm not going to abuse these children. I'm quite capable of reading to someone, helping them read. This has no impact on that.
And they gave you that job?
But yeah, I did. It was only a part. I actually enjoyed it for about a year or so. Yeah. So my mother's health got bad then, and then I had to stop it to look after her.
You're sort of you're on the outside looking in, aren't you? And you're totally reliant on the sort of kindness of others when you find yourself in that situation.
You bump into ex-customers from the shop. You bump into them in the town, or if I'm down the seafront for a walk with a dog, and they'll say, hello, Pauline, how you doing? I'm going, oh, I'm all right and everything. And they go, oh, do you miss the place? And they'll look across the road, and I go, yeah, but I wouldn't want to go through that again, And I've only bumped into one person actually since the conviction's been overturned. And it was actually a member of staff who worked for me for a short period, about 6 months before we went bankrupt. And she said it was a really strange time, wasn't it? She goes, it didn't make any sense. I said it didn't. And she goes, but I never realised. I don't think she even realised the extent of what went on.
Well, none of you did. None of you knew. I mean, there was some quiet journalism going on. A guy called Nick Wallace, a brilliant journalist who has been an absolute dog with a bone on this story. It's remarkable, isn't it? I know we touched on it earlier, but it really is just utterly remarkable that hundreds of these stories were playing out up and down the country, completely independently of themselves. And then I think it's Alan Bates, one of a man who's at the centre of one of those stories, who decides to take a legal action against the post office, and the lid starts to come off, doesn't it?
Yeah, he was the catalyst.
Do you remember when you first? Sorry, Pauline. Do you remember when you first were told or read or heard that there was something afoot that could be connected to the situation that you went through?
I can't remember the date, but I remember reading something, and it was about Alan Bates, actually. It was whether it was on Facebook or somewhere like that, it might have been. And it was, and it came up about, justice of postmasters. And I thought, oh, so there's a potential there. And I was actually in contact with him. I actually contacted him and just said, do you think I'm in the same situation? He said, it sounds awfully like you are. And he said, they were starting this class action, and there was a whole group of them. And initially, I was going to join them, and I was all set to join their group litigation thing and go from there. But even at that point, which was, I think, was it about 2-3 years ago, wasn't it? I think the first time.
I think about 2018.
Yeah. And I was ready to do it then, but even at that point, 10 years on, then from my conviction, the thought of reliving it all and having to remember details and
put it back at the centre of your life. Yeah,
the impact of it all, I couldn't do it because, and also, whereas the difference between solicitors that are involved compared to the ones I've been using, Hudgels, who've been absolutely amazing, and all they've asked for dates and a few little details. But they found everything else out. So because they're solicitors, they can get court records, they can get this, they can get that, and they found out all the information. It's just little bits that I've had to try and remember. But with the Alan Bates grouping, I was literally sent reams and reams of paperwork, and expected to remember the solicitor, 4 numbers, the address, which barrister, dates, everything. And I thought, this is 10 years ago.
And you're putting, and that would involve you reliving, right?
Yes, reliving.
It would involve you kind of taking that, having got through it, having moved forward, to then stepping back into it again. And you didn't. And it's interesting, Pauline. You were very clear at that stage, at least. I can't do that.
No, I can't, because literally, I remember speaking to my father-in-law and my husband, and because they were the big champions of me going forward and pursuing it and getting it overturned. And I said, look, I can't do it. I really can't. I don't want to remember. I don't want to relive it. I want to push it to the back of my brain, choose to forget, choose to think that it never bloody happened, and just get on with my life. I'd rather not. Even if it's just for a short period of time, why would I want to drag that all back up and get myself depressed again? Why would I want to do that?
Yes.
So I chose not to, and I pulled out. And I think at that time, now, obviously in hindsight now, it probably was a good idea that I pulled out. I regretted it for a few years, thinking, perhaps I should have. But then once it started coming through the forefront again, and more postmasters coming forward, and more being successful, and my brother seeing it in the news, seeing some more going through, and he phoned me and he says, Pauline, he says, you've got to do this now. You really have to do this now. It's been long enough. You need to get this overturned. Please do it. I'm going, yeah, no, Mark, but, and I kept giving all these buts, and he's like, but no, you have to do it. And I think it was that day or the day after I got a letter through the post from the post office, basically saying, we think you have a case to have your conviction overturned, part of the Horizon system. Here's a list of solicitors. Choose one and get back to us. I did some research, found Hedgells as being one that's already dealt with quite a few. Contacted them, passed their information on, and it's been really quick. I think that was in May, and I think June it got filed to court, and obviously now November it was overturned. So relatively.
That is the one positive in this story is that once that trigger had been pulled, the process actually has been pretty.
I think it might have been quicker if the court had been quicker. The court system obviously is so slow.
Partly because of COVID as well, I'm sure.
And because of COVID as well.
So it was really when you first talked to Alan Bates, I suppose, that you began to realise that you were part of a much bigger story. How did that feel, Pauline, when you discovered that there were, as we know, around 800 of these cases that have been pursued incorrectly, and one might argue maliciously. How did that feel?
I was shocked more than anything else. Mainly because of the fact that there were so many of us and that they'd hidden it so well. And that how they could get away with it for so long.
Was there a hint of relief?
Yeah, because I think all of us have that in common in the sense of I think we're all made out to be the only ones, especially the early ones. So to then find out that you weren't the only one, it's definitely a relief that you're part of a group. Somebody asked me a question the other week, and it was, are you now in contact with other postmasters? No. Why would I? Do you know what I mean? Yes, it's nice. I've got a few following me now on Twitter, and I wasn't really a Twitter person until recently.
Why aren't you? Why have you chosen not to kind of become part of that sort of community, if you like? Well, you again, for you, it feels like going back to it, and that's not where you want to spend your time.
I haven't been asked, in a sense. Do you know what I mean? I think none of us. I wasn't aware of anybody making contact with others apart from the Alan Bates grouping. But at no point have I been contacted to say, look, I've been in a similar situation to you. So it's only now, because of the case, that I've actually physically met one other person, Gregory, who was in court the same day as me, and his wife. And we now all follow each other on Twitter. Yeah. But apart from that, no, I've had no other contact with anybody else. Yeah. I think it would be a bit weird, having a Facebook page.
Yeah, maybe.
It'd be a bit strange, wouldn't it? Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But I suppose you would have in common that you've all been a similar thing. But apart from sitting there and crying with each other, and sobbing over what a horrible life you've had, what else would you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that strikes me, Pauline, is that you've been through so much, but you're not. There's not much. There's no hint of pity here. You know, you got on and got on with your life, and
you have to when you've got a young family. You have to. In the end, they're my priority. They come first, not me. They come first, and my husband comes a close third. So, you know,
he'd be delighted to hear that, I'm sure.
The children come along, so he knows he's there. I love him. couldn't live without him. But the children, even the oldest one now being 22, she is a big priority of mine still. But she probably comes second now.
They must be so pleased for you that this is ended, or we're not at the end, are we? But is now heading absolutely in the right direction.
Mean when they were younger, they didn't know what was going on, did they? I think it was hard on Alison, especially the oldest one. The fact that through losing the house, we had to move, she had to change school, and she didn't understand why. So
it impacted her life. Yeah.
To an 8-year-old, why she's got to lose her friends and no longer go to school with them.
Yes.
So that was hard for her, but she soon settled into a new school. But I think it did have an impact on her, because I think she was always a good, relatively well-mannered child up until that point. Until I think that happened, I think the changing of schools did impact her on her personality and her anxiety levels, and
would have shown itself. Yeah. So we touched on pity. What about bitterness, which is the other emotion that crisis can create? There are a bunch of individuals that are at the center of this story. The executives that were running the post office at the time. Yeah. We know that there was actually an internal report, fairly significant, I think a number of significant internal reports that told the post office that they'd made this error, and yet they chose to push those reports to one side and push on, as we know, until actually relatively quite recently. There's Fujitsu, who created the system in the first place. Yeah. How do you feel about those individuals? How do you feel about the sort of the sort of corporate body, if you like, that caused all this to happen? Are you bitter?
Oh yes, definitely bitter, because I can't see what their end game was. What were they getting out of this apart from avoiding lawsuits at the time, I suppose. But yeah, I don't get it. I don't understand what their attitude was. I don't understand why they did it, and I think somebody has to be held responsible for that.
What do you want, Pauline? I mean, your conviction has been overturned. There's a compensation process, which I suspect will not be straightforward. So I wish you luck with that, and that you get everything that you deserve. But beyond that, what do you want? Do you feel you obviously don't feel that you've had the proper apology yet?
No, I don't think any of us have had the proper apology. I think we're all in the same boat. And somebody has to be held accountable for the decision making at the top. Obviously, there's been a few chairmen, isn't there, since it started. Mm-hmm. So, who has made that decision? It is a government decision that they're about to follow this line of prosecution. Because if it's been a person, then when that person left and the new one came in, then surely things would have changed. But they carried on doing the same thing. So investigation obviously is happening. Obviously, the inquiry is happening with Sir Wynne. And I really hope that he gets to the bottom of it and that he finds out who is ultimately responsible for making these decisions, because ultimately it is a government-owned organisation. So somebody has to be held accountable. And I don't think we'll be lucky enough for anybody to get a conviction out of this. It'd be nice if somebody could get a conviction, because ultimately they've destroyed lives, haven't they? And somebody has to be held accountable for that.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a number of things I think we could all hope for, but I don't know if we'll ever get it. Even if it is one of the biggest scandals, I don't think we'll ever get total satisfaction.
Well, I mean this in the nicest possible way. I hope you're wrong. And certainly from a media point of view, I think that this story is now beginning to kind of seep into the public consciousness. The journalist that I mentioned earlier has written a brilliant book. I suspect there's going to be, TV programs, films. I think it's in some ways it's a very British scandal, this, to coin a phrase, because it's that's sort of the way that people just kind of kept to themselves and lived through their own individual nightmares is a very British thing, actually. Yeah. It's a remarkable story. I want to mention one other thing, Pauline, before we move on to your crisis cures, which I'm going to ask you for in a second, because it informs your cures, I suspect. But there's been something else going on in your life in the midst of all this as well. You're a breast cancer survivor.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to see that you've come through your treatment and you're out the other side. But that another layer of resilience that you clearly have in you. Just give us the sort of, give us the Pauline sort of crisis program. How have you coped with all this?
I don't take myself too seriously, and I don't take life too seriously. And my father was a prime example of that. My father was exactly the same way. So I think I am my father's daughter. And he'd been through a lot in his life. He had PTSD and obviously then cancer himself, and he carried on regardless. He carried on laughing, he carried on joking, even when he was really poorly. And I think he taught me well. And I could hear him when I think at the start of my diagnosis. And I chose the fact that I wouldn't have a certain cap on, so I would lose my hair. And my attitude was, well, okay, I'll lose my hair, I'll save money on shampoo. And, and yes, I'll lose my eyebrows, but I can draw them back on again. And I'll lose other bodily hair and I'll save money on razors. And, and that's the way I've sort of looked at it all the way through. And yes, I wasn't well. I was 6 months of chemo. It's not a very pleasant experience. And then to go on then to have then 4 surgeries with an infection and God knows what else got thrown at me. But I have actually laughed my way through it. No matter what, like I said to you previously about my children come first and my husband comes first. By me putting a front on, by me saying I am fine, then no one else has to worry about me. Regardless of how I feel inside, regardless of how sick I feel, of my head is banging or whatever, all my children have to care about is the fact that I am fine and that I look okay and that I can still drive her to school and I still go for a coffee with my eldest daughter and I still get the housework done. No matter what, life goes on. And that's the way I looked at it. And there were some days that I wanted to go and crawl into my bed, pull the cover over my head and just say, a lot of you. But that would have been far too easy as far as I was concerned. I got told off by a doctor during the process when I was feeling really, really unwell. And I went to see the GP and he told me off for being too stoic. And I didn't understand what stoic meant, really. And then until it was explained, and I thought, I suppose I am. But I think I'm just too pig-headed and too stubborn to give in to the fact that I was poorly. He wanted me to accept the fact that I was ill, to accept the fact that I had cancer, and to accept the fact that I was going to feel like that. But why should I have to? Why should I accept the fact that was going to happen? Why should I have to crawl into bed and be pampered and be fawned over. Leave me be and let me get on with my life, and I'll be fine. And that's the way I did it. And I did, and I laughed, and I joked, and I did silly selfies with my youngest daughter, and that has honestly helped me 100%.
Pauline, thank you. Before we move on to your crisis cures, then I should say that we're actually talking on the day when I think that the final sort of tick in the box, the final sort of formalising of the process of your conviction being overturned is being completed in a court hearing. And I just want to say to you today, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And for your unbelievable resilience that has come through very loudly and clearly on this podcast, I think. So, Pauline, we would like to ask you for your 3 specific crisis cures. So these are 3 things, can't be another person. 3 specific things that you've lent on, used, deployed during the course of your crisis. What's the first one, please?
Sense of humour.
Yes.
Reading, because it's a form of escapism. I can escape into another world.
And what do you read?
Anything and everything. I have my Kindle, which I'm using now, and I download books constantly with my Kindle account. Yeah. And I read anything and everything, whatever strikes my fancy. So it could be from love stories to thrillers to historical. It doesn't really matter as long as it sort of floats me boat at the time.
Very good. Okay, and the third one?
Jigsaw puzzles, weirdly enough. I've been doing them for years. Yeah. I love jigsaw puzzles. I've been doing them for a long time, even since before my eldest daughter was born. Yeah. It was a way of occupying my evenings when my husband was doing opposite shifts to me. Yes. And we were like ships in a night passing each other. So I would pass the time with a giant 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle on my dining room table. And it's continued even when we had the first daughter, and she would sit on my lap with a jigsaw and help me do my jigsaw or destroy the jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. And they've continued ever since. And I don't do them as often as I used to, but I'll go through a phase and I'll get my jigsaw board out and I'll spot one in the shop and go, oh, I like that one. And I'll do it, and I might get bought one for a birthday. But that's another form of escapism as well. You can just disappear into that. You can be methodical, find your edges, go through the box. Yeah, takes your mind off things, and it just occupies your mind a different way than having to sit there and worry about it and watch the news and worry about your life. You just escape. Very good. Pauline, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. It's as I say, it's a breathtaking story, really, and thank you for sharing. Your part in it. I'm so glad, and I'm sure anyone listening to this will agree with me. I'm so glad that you've come through in the way that you have. And it's, as I say, all power to your strength of character and your resilience. And thank you just for giving us a kind of summary of just how you have managed to cope with this. Thank you so much for your time, and have a lovely Christmas. You too as well. Got